All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Chris Avery, and I am on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to the note in the chat box. Audio is disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. If you have any technical contacts, please contact Tia Biggs. You'll see her name is listed as our technical support person for the day on the participant list. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others as per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. And with that, I will hand it off to Allison Crimmins to get us started.
Thank you so much. All right, welcome everyone. We're here to talk about the 5th National Climate Assessment. Next slide, please. And I am going to start us off with a little background about the National Climate Assessment, or NCA5. And then I will be passing it off to Alexa J., the chapter lead of our overview chapter. We are recording this first part of the webinar today, but when we finish our presentation, we'll turn off the recording and open it up to Q&A. And we're joined by other authors from the overview chapter for that Q&A session as well. Next slide, please. All right, a little background about the National Climate Assessment. The U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP, was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990, and we are mandated to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. USGCRP convenes 14 agencies to advance climate and global change science, and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide, please. That same law, the Global Change Research Act of 1990, mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or NCA. The NCA analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors, including the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. And USGCRP is also charged with assessing observed trends and projected trends for the next 25 to 100 years. NCAs are used by organizations and individuals for a really wide variety of purposes, including national, state, and local policymaking, for risk management in the private sector, for local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as use by many practitioners, utility managers, and in formal and informal education settings. Next slide, please. NCA authors review a really large body of scientific research from diverse information sources, and they synthesize that information, examine our confidence in the scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. So NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation. The assessments are designed to be policy relevant. Authors are distilling their findings into really accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive. It does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, but it leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their own risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. And finally, I'll note that the report process involves really extensive review, which includes several opportunities for public engagement, a peer review conducted by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several rounds of government scientific reviews. Next slide, please. We are, of course, on our 5th National Climate Assessment, or NCA5. We started that work on this assessment in January of 2020. So the report that you can access now is a culmination of years of work. And you're seeing on this slide our table of contents. So like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers physical science in chapters 1 and 2, or excuse me, chapters 2 and 3. We have a range of national level topics in the rest of that first column and second column. We have 10 regional chapters, and we have chapters on our response, so adaptation and mitigation. The NCA chapter list has evolved over time and really been informed by user input. And to that effect, we have 2 new chapters in NCA5, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. And we also have 5 new focus features, one on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. So really a ton of information available throughout the report. And we encourage you to dive in and explore both the climate risks and climate actions in your part of the country. Next slide, please. NCA5 also includes some key advancements in our understanding of how climate change affects the United States. So we have incorporated some novel observations and improved modeling that have advanced our understanding of current and future climate change, which is really helpful in providing critical risk management information. I mentioned our 2 new chapters. Those chapters provide new insights into how people in the US experience climate change and how climate actions are understood and communicated and implemented. We've also explored major themes of environmental justice and equity beyond just the social systems and justice chapter, really themes that run through every single chapter of the report, which helps broaden our understanding of how climate impacts exacerbate social inequities. We also highlight many local and state climate mitigation and adaptation actions. And we have done some work in NCA5 to expand representation of parts of the United States that are not always well represented, in particular, what we call parts of the United States that are outside of the contiguous US, or OCONUS. So regions like Alaska, Hawaii, and affiliated Pacific Islands, and the US Caribbean. We did a lot of work to make sure that those regions are also included in our figures and in the report. Next slide, please. So with that, I will turn it over to Alexa, our chapter lead, to walk you through the 5 key takeaways or themes of NCA5, and also to point you where you can find more information throughout the report.
All right, thank you, Allison. So hi, everyone. I'm Alexa J. I am a science writer with the U.S. Global Change Research Program and a contractor with ICF, and I'm the chapter lead for the NCA5 overview. And thanks for being with us today. Next slide, please. So the first big message of the assessment is that we are seeing communities across the country taking action in response to climate change. These actions include both measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, known collectively as mitigation, and actions to adjust systems and practices to change climate conditions, known as adaptation. Since 2018, when the 4th climate assessment was released, city and state level adaptation plans and actions increased by 32%, which you can see by state in the green bars on the left of the graphic there. These actions were complemented by a 14% increase in the total number of new state level mitigation activities, shown in blue bars on the right. We've observed US emissions falling since they peaked in 2007, while GDP and population have increased. And if you're interested in learning more about what those actions look like, you'll find a table in the overview chapter that provides some examples by region. And you'll also find, as Allison mentioned, case studies on mitigation and adaptation actions throughout the report. Next slide, please. So the observed decline in US emissions so far is due primarily to a decrease in electricity generation from coal. But we have also seen a lot of growth in renewable energy capacities supported by rapidly falling costs of zero and low carbon energy technologies, which you can see in the figure here for wind and solar energy and electric vehicle batteries. Wind energy costs dropped 70% and solar energy costs dropped 90% over the last decade, while 80% of new generation capacity in 2020 came from renewable sources. And recent legislation is expected to further increase deployment of low and zero carbon energy technologies. Next slide, please. At the same time, more and more people across the US are experiencing the effects of climate change right now in their everyday lives, especially through the impacts of extreme weather events. As temperatures rise, people are experiencing longer lasting and more extreme heat waves. Many other extremes, including heavy precipitation, drought, flooding, wildfire, and hurricanes, are increasing in frequency and/or severity. In the 1980s, the country experienced on average $1 billion weather and climate disaster every 4 months. Now there is one every 3 weeks on average. So this map here is showing damages from the $89 billion events we experienced in the 5 years since NCA4, so from 2018 to 2022. And so far this year, we're already up to $25 billion events. Another big takeaway from the report is that climate disasters that occur in one region of the country can have cascading or compounding effects in other regions or sectors. NCA5's new chapter on economics finds that climate change impacts and damages will impose substantial new costs to the US economy and limit economic opportunities for many Americans. Climate change impacts and risks also threaten critical infrastructure and public services, ecosystems, and our culture, including many pastimes and traditions. Next slide, please. So we know that the more the planet warms, the greater the impacts, greater the risks from sea level rise, intensifying extreme events, and other harmful impacts, some of which are shown in the figure here for the US under different levels of future warming. And we also know that the US is warming faster than the global average. So every degree and every fraction of a degree of additional warming brings more severe climate impacts to the US and greater economic losses. But the flip side of that coin is true as well, meaning that every degree or every tenth of a degree of warming that the world avoids matters for reducing these risks to the US. Next slide, please. Next, equity and justice are major themes across the report, not just in the social systems and justice chapter, which is new to the NCA, but a thread running through nearly every chapter of the report. The assessment notes that some communities that are already overburdened by environmental risks experience higher risks from climate impacts due to the cumulative effects of social and economic inequities caused by ongoing systemic discrimination, exclusion, and under or disinvestment. Low-income communities and communities of color often lack access to adequate flood infrastructure, green spaces, safe housing, and other resources that help protect people from climate impacts. As one example, this map you're seeing shows the relationship between land surface temperature and median household income in Atlanta, Houston, and Minneapolis, reflecting a trend that lower income urban neighborhoods tend to experience higher surface temperatures, leaving them more exposed to health risks from extreme heat. There are also several regional chapters that show historically redlined community maps overlaid with heat maps in the Bronx in the Northeast chapter and in Portland, Oregon in the Northwest chapter in particular. Historically redlined neighborhoods can be as much as 12 degrees Fahrenheit hotter during a heat wave than nearby wealthier neighborhoods, demonstrating the continued effects of depriving communities equitable access to environmental amenities like urban green spaces. Next slide, please. And this trend extends to flooding as well. The assessment found that neighborhoods that are home to racial minorities and low-income residents have the highest inland flood exposures in the South. And across the entire nation, Black communities are expected to experience a disproportionate share of future flood damages. This figure you're seeing shows that the average annual losses or the economic damages in a typical year due to floods in census tracts with a Black population of at least 20% are projected to increase at roughly twice the rate of that in tracts where Black populations make up less than 1% of the population. Next slide, please. The fourth big takeaway is about what mitigation and adaptation actions are within reach right now, and what actions would be needed to limit the increase in severe climate risks to the US. So the US has committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which would mean that emissions fall to zero or that any residual emissions are balanced by removal of carbon from the atmosphere. This commitment is consistent with international climate goals of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial era. And while US emissions have fallen, the current rate of decline is not enough to meet this target. We can get a long way towards our goal of net zero by 2050 with widespread implementation of currently available and cost-effective mitigation options. And you'll see some of these established opportunities in the figure shown here, which lays out the portfolio of mitigation options for achieving net zero emissions in the US. But to reach this target, we would need to move much faster and go much further in our mitigation efforts than we have so far. To reach the net zero targets, we would need to expand our annual growth in wind and solar capacity faster than we've ever done it before. And we would need to be looking at additional options and technologies, both for reducing emissions, which are shown in red on the far right of the figure on the top, and increasing carbon uptake, shown in blue on the bottom there. Next slide, please. Limiting severe climate risks to the US requires not just deeper cuts in global net emissions, but also accelerated adaptation efforts. And while adaptation planning and implementation have advanced in the US, to date, many adaptation efforts have been incremental in nature and small in scale. To keep pace with climate change and adequately address risks, in many cases, more transformative adaptation actions will be needed. These are actions that don't just treat the symptoms, but prepare our country for the climate risks we will face in the future. For example, this might involve redesigning cities and buildings to address unprecedented heat risks, or directing new development to less flood-prone areas as risks from sea level rise continue to increase. Next slide, please. The fifth and final takeaway is about the benefits of mitigation and proactive adaptation investments. We know that actions taken now to accelerate net emissions reductions and adapt to ongoing climate changes can reduce risks to current and future generations. And while some of the climate benefits from even aggressive emissions cuts may not be detectable before the middle of the century, there are many immediate or near-term benefits from taking mitigation and adaptation actions, like almost immediate improvements in air quality and other benefits to human health from reducing fossil fuel emissions. The assessment finds that taking climate action now has the potential to improve well-being, strengthen resilience, protect ecosystems, benefit the economy, and in part, redress legacies of racism and injustice. Next slide, please. A just transition is the process of responding to climate change with transformative actions that address the root causes of vulnerability to climate impacts, while ensuring equitable access to jobs, affordable low-carbon energy, environmental benefits such as reduced air pollution, and quality of life for all. Effective and just transitions involve reducing impacts to overburdened communities, increasing resources to underserved communities, and integrating diverse worldviews, cultures, experiences, and capacities into mitigation and adaptation actions. One example of near-term benefits is the increase in renewable and low-carbon energy jobs, which are expected to completely offset losses in the number of fossil fuel-related jobs in aggregate, shown in the figure here. As the country shifts to low-carbon energy industries, a just transition would include job creation and training for displaced fossil fuel workers, as well as addressing existing racial and gender disparities in energy workforces. So that is it for our summary, and we hope that you'll take a look at the overview chapter and the entire report to explore these findings even further. And I will turn it back over to Allison now to tell us about some of the resources released alongside the assessment, and then we will move over to Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexa. And if you could go to the next slide, please. We really wanted NCA5 to not just be a giant book that's gathering dust on your shelf somewhere. We wanted people to think of the National Climate Assessment as a guide or a tool to inform climate decisions. So in that vein, we took a lot of strides when we were developing this report to make sure that it was really useful and usable. We improved our accessibility and our website functionality. I think Eliza noted in our chat, we are translating the entire assessment into Spanish for the first time ever. Those will be available in spring of 2024. We also created some new paths of entry into the assessment through art and poetry. We've developed 6 podcast episodes and also a recorded audiobook reading of the overview chapter if you're someone who likes to listen to audiobooks rather than read. And then I want to highlight one of the items on the screen in the middle, our interactive online atlas. If you could go to the next slide, please. We developed this online interactive atlas at atlas.globalchange.gov, which is to let people explore and create maps of climate impacts in your own state or your own county. So you can go to this tool, pick the climate variable of interest to you, whether it's days over 95 degrees or how much additional rain should I expect to fall on the heaviest rain days. And then you can zoom into your state or county and get really specific information about your area and screenshot or download that map and drop it right into whatever you might be using it for, whether it's your own mitigation or adaptation plan or reports. So just another way to really make the data from NCA5 more accessible to people. Next slide, please. We are also holding NCA5 chapter webinars, which I think many of you know since you're on one of them. This is the first webinar, but we are doing a webinar for every chapter in the report. And you can find the webinar schedule and registration links at globalchange.gov/NCA5 under the webinars tab. So with that, I think we can stop the recording.